Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible to get your free audiobook today. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Jim Ostrowski about his book, Progressivism, a primer on the idea destroying America. Jim is, of course, the author of Progressivism, a primer on the idea destroying America, and most recently is a co-author with Michael Ostrowski of the impeachment of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton for high crimes in Syria and Libya. He's also the author of Direct Citizen Action, How We Can Win the Second Amendment Revolution Without Firing a Shot, and he is the CEO of LibertyMovement.org, which attempts to bring new strategies and tactics to the Liberty Movement. You can follow his work at LibertyMovement.org. You can find him on Facebook under Jim Ostrowski and on Twitter at Jim Ostrowski. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/progressivism. Jim, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot to Adam for having me on.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. So since we're going to be discussing progressivism today, let's start out with a definition. What is progressivism?
Well, that's why I spent 200 pages defining it. So I have a really short definition, and then in the book, there's like an 8-part definition, and we can get into that in detail. But so to me, the progressive says that for any sort of new problem coming down the highway, that some sort of government action will do a better job solving that problem than the market or society or the voluntary sector. I think that's a pretty good introductory definition of it. And then in the book, I have sort of an 8-part, analysis of what that actually means.
Sure, and we'll get into that in a moment, but the subtitle of your book is very provocative, I guess we could say, referring to progressivism as the idea destroying America. So can you give an overview or a couple of highlights on why progressivism is the idea destroying America?
Well, it's a big question, and it's a good question. I do believe that America is, for the first time, actually declining. And that's after since 1605, Jamestown, all the way through just a couple of decades ago, we were always moving forward by any really objective measure. There were problems, there were wars, there was slavery and so on, but the general trend was upward and towards improvement. But I think in the last several years, and I think 9/11 is actually a good sort of demarcation line, that there's a sense of, and the reality of actual palpable decline. And I know that, whenever people hear the sky is falling, they're skeptical. So the first part of the book is an introduction, and it's a very long introduction that just sort of goes through the various aspects of America as it was, 2 years ago when I published the book. And it's similar now, and just going through various aspects of society, such as health and the economy and education and crime and so on, and just saying, what the actual state of America is. And it was and is, pretty grim. And I get, there's not a lot of statistics in the book, but the most of the statistics are in the introduction. Just things like the typical net worth of the average American, which is quite low when you consider the fact that the net worth of the average person is largely tied up in your home, and you can't eat your home, and you can't drive your home, and you really can't even spend your home unless you go into further debt. So the average American is not particularly wealthy after 100 years of where progressivism kind of took over the politics of the country, and has been intensifying ever since, and including up through the Obama administration. Trump, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I do think that after a period of stagnation, maybe starting around the 70s, we're actually declining, and you see that in a lot of different areas of life.
Yeah, and we'll get into what might have happened in the 70s to cause this, and we'll get into 9/11 as a turning point. But can you give a little more of an overview of your book and how it's structured and what's in it before we move on to some more of the topics, more of the specific topics that are covered?
I'm a big believer in titles that actually say what's in the book. That the good problem actually with the title is that although progressivism is covered as a primer, and the notion of it destroying America, that's all covered. There's actually a lot more in the book, so there's a little bit of false advertising, but that's to the benefit of the reader. As I already talked about, the introduction is sort of a blow-by-blow account of the depressing state of America today. And then I jump right into chapter 1 and just say, what is progressivism? That's the title. And I think the problem with the word progressivism, like a lot of words, is that there wasn't really a clear understanding of what that term means. It's one of these terms that is thrown around, and it may mean a number of different things, and it really does mean a number of different things. And I'm not necessarily disputing or dealing with all those things. I'm not talking about socially progressive, and I'm not actually talking about, progress in the objective sense. What I'm really talking about is that now let me exclude some other concepts of progressivism. Now, the progressives, the capital P progressives that we all learned about in school, they had a lot of, procedural reforms in government. I'm not really talking about let's have popular election of senators instead of senators, elected by the state legislatures and so on. I'm really talking about substantive progressivism. What is it going to do at the end of the day, or what is it not going to do? So that's really what the book is about. And I've already given sort of a simple definition of it, but in the chapter 1, I break it down into 8 different elements, and some of them are maybe not very controversial, but some of them I think are really controversial and important. Some progressives themselves would say, "Oh yeah, it is." For example, number 1 is simply it's a mindset about politics. I don't think that Hillary Clinton would deny that. She might describe it slightly differently. Now, number 2 is quite controversial, which is a mindset that has no rational basis. Now, I don't just say that. In the course of the book, that's explained, and hopefully make a prima facie case for that proposition. 3 is that it is utopian, and that is explained in really throughout the book. 4 is that it favors the use of democratic government force to solve human problems, and I don't think that's really deniable. They may justify it as democratic, but they can't say that it's not force, because that would be absurd. That 5 is that force is better than voluntary society in the market. 6 I think is really, may sound obvious, but it's actually of critical importance to understanding this mindset of progressivism, that progressivism has no theory of costs, or denies or minimizes the costs of its proposed solutions. And in the book, I give the example of Social Security, which raised taxes or cut benefits, 25, 30 times. And nobody, because it was an unsustainable program, and nobody ever said, or seriously said, or argued that, this is costing too much. we better scrap the program. So, but that's just a specific example of a more general proposition, is that progressives generally have no theory of costs or deny or minimize those costs. And this is true every time they open their mouth. And if you, Patrick Cray, who reviewed the book, he said, after reading the book, I sort of watched the news in a different way. And I think it is that kind of book that illuminates, watching the news and watching politics. But if you listen carefully to any new proposal by a progressive, they never say what the cost is. And they certainly never say, well, where's the money coming from? And they absolutely never, ever, ever say what the opportunity costs of those costs are. In other words, how people are going to be harmed by being deprived of that. So that's actually a huge, number 6 is a huge element. Number 7 is, I think, maybe the core of the book, and maybe the most controversial one. And obviously progressives themselves will deny that it's true, but, and we're almost near the end. But basically, so after analyzing what progressives say and do and how they think and act, I conclude that it's not a rational philosophy, therefore it must be something else. And basically what I conclude is that, and now I know that people have often referred to liberalism, which I object to the use of, but they mean, I think, progressivism, that progressivism is a mental illness. I don't go there because, for a lot of reasons, because I don't think it is a mental illness, but calling something a mental illness is really a pseudo explanation. It doesn't really give you any information. It just sort of, let's close that drawer and forget about that problem and not really understand what it is. So, but I do prefer to call it a form of therapy. In other words, that people use progressive ideas not because they have any objective or scientific or rational or historical or any sort of rational basis for believing that they will work, but that people want a sense of control. I think this is an essential part of human psychology that I don't think really is deniable, and that these ideas give them a sense of control over what is very often a very scary world that is beyond our control and maybe often beyond our understanding. And if you want me to give you a concrete example, there was a plane crash very near Buffalo in a suburb called Clarence, which is about maybe 15 miles from my house. A couple years ago, it was like a weather-related storm that the plane was flying. It was a very sad and tragic thing. I believe everybody on the plane was killed. And then it ultimately got into the fact that the pilot wasn't super experienced and that the co-pilot was even less experienced and that she wasn't being paid very much and she was living on, she was sleeping on the couch in her parents' house because she wasn't being paid very much. So this whole set of proposals, the progressive, of course, and in the book, this is called liberty reduction as a form of grieving. Every time there's a tragedy, the progressive thinks, what sort of new law will solve this problem? And long story short, I had to, I don't want to say laugh because there's nothing funny about a plane crash, but when they proposed this thing, hey, we need mandatory new training for pilots. And I thought at the time, it's like, good luck with that because the underlying economics doesn't make any sense. And I believe they've been struggling for a number of years because the airlines said, we can't even have an industry if we comply with these rules. So the point is, though, that this, passing a law that says, we have to have more hours of training for pilots. Now, I don't think that there's any rational reason to believe that will solve the problem without creating other new problems that didn't exist before. But one thing is for certain, that this makes progressives sleep better at night and maybe are more comfortable flying in an airplane. So it's a form of therapy to make the progressive feel better. And I think that's maybe the key contribution of the book. And then the final element is actually also extremely important, along with some of the others that I mentioned. And that is that, quote, progressivism has no limiting principle and therefore tends towards creeping totalitarianism. And this is something, I didn't really come up with this theory, just sort of staring at the wall or staring at a chalkboard or just cogitating. But the book, I think the part of the value of the book is that I've been watching progressive politicians for several decades very closely on a daily basis. I know a lot of them. I know a lot of progressives. I have progressives in my family, engaged in a lot of discussions with progressives. And I feel like all those experiences led up to this sort of insight that there is no limiting principle. They're never done. It's all a piecemeal construction of something that they have no grand vision for. But as the decades go by, all of a sudden, you realize there's really literally no aspect of your life that's not regulated by the state, and that the regulations aren't stopping, and they keep building up, and there's no limiting principle. And I think that's a really important thing to understand about progressivism. So that's the basic 8-part test.
Right, and it's not just that they're finding new aspects of your life to try to get involved in. As Mises pointed out, whenever the government intervenes in some area to try to fix something, then that just creates more problems and in turn more interventions. So there's no limiting principle, but also the interventions that they engage in then lead to even more interventions. So you have it coming from that area as well. But I want to look at where this whole idea of progressivism comes from, where it originates. So what are the origins of progressivism, and when did this idea really start gaining traction?
Well, again, you ask a really important question. And the thing is, I'm not sure I really have an answer to it. It is very difficult, I find, it's nice to think that you could go back into history and figure out where ideas come from. And I did make an attempt in the book to talk about some of the historical antecedents of progressivism. And we have some knowledge about where some of these ideas come from. But it's almost impossible, unless you have like this gigantic computer that doesn't exist with data that hasn't been generated yet, to figure out exactly why people think the way they do. So I do talk about some of the historical precedents, but I can't literally prove that there's a direct causal connection to how people think now. So although I talk about some of the precedents, such as the French Revolution, which really made like the idea of majority rule kind of an ultimate principle, which really fits into the whole progressive mindset. I think the Civil War, Lincoln's general governmental policy, I think, is sort of a proto-progressivism. You have the government school movement, which precedes the formal progressive era, but is really kind of an example of progressivism before they called it progressivism. There are these historical antecedents that are important to understand, but what I tried to do, and I don't know if reverse engineering is the best way to describe it, but what I really tried to capture in the book is, what do actual living American progressives, and by that I count like the vast majority of Americans, the way I define the term, what do these people really think right now? And then I tried to figure out all the things that belief entails, and that's where I have the 8-part test. So although it's interesting to look at the origins, and history is obviously important, and it's good to go back and maybe show that some of the antecedents, ended badly or had no rational basis, as in the example of government schools. At the end of the day, this mindset sort of stands on its own, and it is what it is. And I think that we can understand it on its own terms, as I argue in the book, not a rational system of thought, but a form of self-help therapy.
Sure. And on the subject of government schools and the beginning of the public school movement, I'll just mention that I have done an episode on that subject with David Rodriguez. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/progressivism, the show notes page for this episode, will have links to that episode. But earlier you mentioned that there's really no rational basis for progressivism. Can you explain a little more of what you mean by that and why progressivism always leads to so many failures?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things I'm doing in the book is, and it's, again, the false advertising to the benefit of the reader, is that it's also a book about libertarianism. Now, if anybody who has read the book knows, I'm not a huge fan of this word, libertarianism, and that's maybe a 1-hour show, but that's the word we're stuck with at the moment. But historians called it liberalism. There may be other words for it, but progressivism is superimposed on a pre-existing ideology, which was never perfectly put into operation, obviously, but we call it liberalism or classical liberalism. And there's never the progressive looked at, the results of liberalism, and basically in a sort of a utopian sense, without any, again, rational basis, said, well, we don't like this, and we think we can do better by having, various government programs. I mean, that's basically what progressivism is. And I don't know if the progressive could really fancy that up anymore, but that's basically what it is. But there was never any point in actual history where they proved scientifically, rationally, through empirical data, historically or factually, that whatever the limitations of pre-progressive America or England under classical liberalism, imperfectly installed, but with a relatively free market and a relatively large amount of individual liberty, there was never any process where they proved that they could do better than this. And so I guess it's almost like proving a negative. They never made the case. But moreover than that, I do go through in the book and I pick apart what progressivism actually entails. And I first do sort of a theoretical analysis using a lot of the insights from the great libertarian thinkers, the Austrian economists. I'm a disciple of Rothbard, whom I knew, and attended his lecture series on the history of economic thought. And so I apply a lot of those theoretical insights to explain in general terms why the progressive program cannot succeed. And in that section, I break down, sometimes I lose count, but I think I came up with 6 different things that progressive government does. And some of the obvious ones are taxation, regulation are the 2 main ones, but some of them are less obvious. They include eminent domain and conscription, war, and I think number 6 is inflation. So I go through, a theoretical analysis of each of these things and show how each of them actually has certain undeniable consequences in which the wealth of one part of society is reduced at the expense of another part of society, but with the overall effect of reducing the incentive of all to produce goods and services and things that are valuable. And then to cap it off, I pick some of the marquee progressive programs to show on a more specific basis why and how these programs have failed. And it's funny, I try to crib off of work that's already been done. I mean, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, but with one specific program, there didn't seem to be a lot of libertarians who'd taken a hacksaw to Social Security. So on that one, I kind of had to, start from scratch to some extent. Rothbard had done a little bit of work on it, and maybe others. But on that one, I kind of had to start from scratch and hammer Social Security. And, I'm pretty fearless. I'm not running for office, so I don't really care. And just show why that program is a failure. And then some of the other marquee programs, I know I went after government funding for the arts, which is not like one of the most important progressive programs, but it's one of their sort of marquee programs, and they're very proud of that. And to show why that failed, and the war on drugs, government schools, and so on. So there is some very specific policy analysis after the theoretical section that hopefully will convince the reader that progressivism has failed and must fail by its nature.
Yeah, and since you brought up the Social Security issue in there and said that the hacksaw that you took to that program was largely original in terms of it being more your thinking than built on the thinking of others. Can you explain a little bit of why Social Security is a failure? Because that seems to fly in the face of everything we hear.
Well, I'm looking at the section now. I mean, for one thing, one of the points I make in that section is that everybody would love a situation where no elderly person would ever be poor, but it's a violation. It's just an example of the progressive mindset that there are no costs. So the progressive never asks, well, where's this money coming from? And the money is coming from somewhere, and the money really comes from younger workers. And particularly if you're self-employed, the total Social Security, and I think they have Medicare in there as well, same ball of wax, is 15.3%. So if you're self-employed, you are really getting hammered, and you really understand this because you have to write the darn checks several times a year to pay that. And I know that some of the people in the lower tax brackets are hammered by the Social Security self-employment tax even more than the income tax. And so you have far less wealthy, middle-aged or younger group than would be without the Social Security. And of course, they don't have the money to save up so that they wouldn't need this government program later. Now, another argument I make is that, what they are obviously, because the program is insolvent, intrinsically not economically or sound on an accounting basis. One of the things they have to do is inflate the money supply to pay these the checks. So and another little argument that I make, just to throw this out, is that the Democratic Party particularly, but the Republican Party to some extent also, they're always trying to reassure senior citizens that, don't worry, your Social Security will be there in 20 years. So there's an intrinsic contradiction there. Social Security is supposed to be secure, but if it was secure, why are the Democrats constantly saying that it's not secure? So even if you like the program, it's just it's not in the Constitution. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a constitutional lawyer as well. It's not in the Constitution. And even if you like Social Security and think it's great, in spite of all of its costs, there's no guarantee that it's going to exist next week. Congress could simply, if there was a different political movement or wave or whatever, or there was a financial distress and they had to get rid of it, they could get rid of Social Security next week. All they'd have to do is have the House and the Senate pass a bill. Social Security is hereby abolished. President signs it or doesn't sign it, and his veto is overridden, and Social Security would not exist next week. So, in a sense, the whole program is not secure, and to the extent that that's a big selling point for Social Security, it's actually a bit of a fraud. And I use the extreme example of Confederate war bonds. Social Security is only good as long as the United States of America exists. Now, again, listeners may think, well, who is this guy? Is he predicting that the United States is going to cease to exist? No, I'm not making any such prediction. But I will say that if you look at all the major empires in history, there's been about 16 of them, and 15 of them are gone. And nobody thought they would cease to exist. So there's a number of other arguments, but I try to, I'm a trial lawyer, so sometimes I argue in court. Somebody's life is on the line, or life imprisonment, because we don't have the death penalty in New York. And I'm used to, hammering the opponent's argument pretty hard. And I take no prisoners, and I really go after it. And I think by the end of that section, you would have to admit that I've made a pretty good case against Social Security.
All right, everybody. I'm going to do a favor for you, and you're going to do a favor for me. Are you ready? My favor for you is telling you how to get a free audiobook. Here's how you do it. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible and sign up for one of Audible's free 30-day trials. This will allow you to get a free audiobook download from Audible that you get to keep regardless of whether you end up getting a paid subscription. You can choose from books we've covered on the show, such as The Primal Prescription by Bob Murphy and Doug McGuff, or Base Nation by David Vine. Or you can choose The Impeachment of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton for High Crimes in Syria and Libya, co-authored by today's guest, Jim Ostrowski, along with Michael Ostrowski. Or you can choose from any of the over 180,000 audiobooks Audible has to offer. Your favor for me is getting your free audiobook and thus supporting the show. To download your free audiobook today, go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/audible to get your free audiobook right now and to help keep the Wake Up Call podcast going. Sure. Now, in your book, you draw a connection between war and progressivism. Now, of course, with the way those words are typically used, a lot of people think, well, progressives are opposed to war and they're a part of anti-war movements. But that's not necessarily the case. So what is the connection that you draw between war and progressivism, and why is war actually a progressive program?
Okay, well, first of all, when I was at the beginning of the show, I was explaining what the word progressive can mean other than the way that I mean it in the book. One of the definitions of progressivism is like the left wing of the Democratic Party. So in that sense, people say, well, Bernie Sanders is a progressive and Hillary Clinton isn't. Well, they're both progressives. In fact, most of the Republican Party is too, according to the definition of the book. But there is that slightly different use of the term, the left wing of the Democratic Party, which does, on the extreme left, does have a tendency to be against some wars, although there's a lot of jokes going around now that we're about to have another peace movement because we'll have a Republican in the White House. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. And even Bernie Sanders has supported some wars. I believe he supported the war in Serbia. If not that one, there have been examples of wars he supported
that one.
But leaving all that aside, so I think you have to understand that the progressive is a utopian. The progressive believes that government can solve problems, and all of the domestic things that government does, that the progressive wants government to do, are all involve coercion, force, and ultimately violence, which is best seen if you resist. It's lesser seen when you don't resist, when you capitulate. So there's nothing particularly peaceful or nice about the progressive. And the other thing about the progressive is a centralizer. Since the progressive basically worships power as the means to create utopia on earth, the more centralized the government is, the more powerful it is. So I argue that there's a kernel of progressivism in Lincoln's argument for the Civil War, which is that basically, he believed in central. I understand he was arguing on the basis of democracy, but those are closely related concepts. But I argue in the book that Lincoln was a progressive because Lincoln wanted to have the federal government exercise its powers over a larger territory rather than a smaller territory. So the progressive is a centralizer. The progressive is, by nature, an interventionist. So there's nothing particularly peaceful about that. And if you look at history, you'll find that, Woodrow Wilson, who was a capital P progressive and a small p progressive, by any definition of progressive, worked pretty hard to get us involved in World War I. FDR worked pretty hard to get us involved in World War II, and that's been covered by, the great historian Ralph Raico, who recently died, and he was a friend of mine and lived in Buffalo, and Rothbard and the other libertarian historians, Higgs and others, have covered that. If you look at LBJ, Kennedy getting us involved in Vietnam, Truman in Korea. There's really I can't exhaust the whole topic, on this show, but there's plenty of empirical evidence that actual existing progressive political figures have gotten us into plenty of wars. Obama had no problem expanding the war in Afghanistan, and got us involved in the war in Libya as well. In fact, it's in the recent book we cited Obama's explanation of why things didn't work out in Libya is saying that we didn't put enough resources in there, and that was just like the classic sort of progressive argument that not that intervention failed because there's anything wrong with intervention or government intervention, but that we just needed to put more resources into it, and that's an example. It's a classic example of the progressive mindset.
Sure. Now, you mentioned in there a lot of the major figures that are associated with progressivism and some that aren't associated with progressivism the way that word is often used, but should definitely be associated with progressivism the way that we're using that term today. But who have been some of the other major figures behind progressivism, advocating for progressivism, and who have been some of the major figures fighting against and opposing progressivism?
Well, the cover of the book, I think, has a pretty good chain of figures. You start with Rousseau, who built up this idea of that the ultimate foundation of what was good in society was majority rule, which is obviously an element of progressivism. And then you get into Hamilton with his belief that positive government intervention in the economy through inflation and subsidies and so on would we would have a faster and better economic growth. And Jefferson, who was not a progressive, I know there's a big debate about what Jefferson was. Jefferson was not a progressive in that sense. He was basically a libertarian when it came to these issues. Then you go on to Lincoln, who, leaving aside the Civil War, since the Democrats were no longer in the Senate, the Republicans could do whatever they wanted. He created massive new government programs, many of which are still with us, and supported inflation and the income tax and war for the purpose of centralizing and maintaining centralized power. Oliver Holmes is in there. He's one of my favorite villains, and he kind of helped to erode the libertarian aspect of the Constitution. Progressives really don't believe in constitutions at all. There's a section in the book about that, which I think is pretty interesting, about the fallacy of constitutionalism. That's under a chapter critiquing conservatives, which again is not, you would not expect this book to be, has spent a tremendous amount of time critiquing the concept of conservatism and the actual conservative movement, but you get that that's a freebie with the price of the book. And then Teddy Roosevelt obviously was an important figure. We talked about Wilson and FDR, and then LBJ, I think, is a significant figure for expanding. He wanted to expand the New Deal into areas that FDR never got it into, and he created Medicare and Medicaid programs that we continue to be stuck with now. And Obama, I think, is picture on the cover. I'm trying to figure out who to replace him with, but I think I'll keep him there for the time being. You talked about Mises's principle that the intervention leads to more intervention. Well, Medicare and Medicaid in a variety of ways led to huge problems in the healthcare industry. And then, so the choice is, do you go back to the free market or do you create more intervention? And of course, Obama is definitely a progressive, and hence you have Obamacare trying to go in there and solve the problem of affordability, which in many, many ways is the cause of all the prior progressive interventions in the healthcare market, which go back all the way to occupational licensure. And that is, by the way, one of the marquee progressive programs that's critiqued in the book. And I think that section is pretty interesting because as a lawyer, I have a pretty good understanding of the whole licensing process and why it's actually a fallacy that government licensing of occupations produces any net good.
Sure. And who have been some of the major figures fighting against and opposing progressivism?
Well, progressivism, okay, so that's another good question. So progressivism, again, is superimposed onto liberalism. Liberalism dies out around the end of the Grover Cleveland administration. Has sort of its last hurrah with opposition to the Spanish-American War, and Mark Twain was a figure in that, a really underrated sort of libertarian figure in many ways. But then the progressives pretty much have free reign to the point where, like when my father went to college and after the war in the late 40s, I mean, he never would have seen any real libertarian or liberal critique of much of anything. The progressives sort of had free reign, but the opposition, there had to be some sort of opposition, and that opposition basically became the conservative movement. And the book critiques conservatism as basically a reactive force with no program or plan of its own, always saying, slow down, or you're going too fast, or we need a 3% tax cut over what you progressives want. And basically one of the arguments in the book is that conservatism has basically failed. But I think really the opposition to the leading opponent of progressivism, I would say, is Rothbard. I heard him speak in 1980, and I believe the first speech he gave was a critique of how the progressives helped get us into World War I, and obviously opposed the progressive program in every conceivable way. So I think really the real adversary of progressives, and I think they know this, are the libertarians, because the conservatism is such a muddled concept. And they've obviously shown for 50, 60 years they're completely ineffective in opposing conservatism. I mean, you just look at all the major progressive programs that have passed, and then ask yourself which ones have conservatives gotten rid of when they had power, and they have had considerable power over the years. And I got very down in the weeds on that. Explaining when they controlled the Congress, when they controlled the presidency, when they controlled virtually everything. And I know George Bush had, for at least 2 years, the Republicans controlled every branch of government. And actually, currently, they're quite powerful again, and they'll soon have a 5-4 majority in the Supreme Court. But they never seem to get rid of anything. There's almost no. They can't even seem to want to get rid of Obamacare. They want to replace it and keep some of its most odious elements. So I think the answer to your question is the libertarians, and obviously, from my point of view, the leading libertarian is Rothbard, but there have been a number of others.
Yeah, and with these people that are supposedly conservatives in regards to Obamacare, we never hear them just say they want to repeal Obamacare. It's always repeal and replace, and then even that gets watered down eventually. You don't have that firm opposition to what we've identified as progressivism, and we don't see any victories from quote unquote conservatives in opposing progressivism. But of course, the whole term conservative in the United States context anyways far too often is just referring to people who are affiliated with the Republican Party. And of course, so many of them are in fact progressives with the definition we've been using today. So we shouldn't really expect them to be opposing progressivism when many of these people are progressives.
Yeah, I think the reader will be interested in that chapter. It's a very detailed critique of conservatism and why it's failed. I cite Hayek, I cite Mises and others, and I put together kind of a trial lawyer summation against conservatism, culminating in one of my favorite parts of the book, frankly, which is a critique of constitutionalism. And I think that so often conservatives sort of worship the Constitution, and I'm pretty cynical about this. I think it's because they don't have a positive program for what to do with the government. And it's always like, well, we need to go back to the Constitution. And I have a pretty detailed critique of why constitutionalism has failed. I think there's many valuable ideas in the Constitution. I think many of the things in the Constitution, particularly in the Bill of Rights, are true. What I'm saying when I attack constitutionalism is this procedural concept that constitutions will save us from all-powerful government. And I think the evidence that is false is just overwhelming. And I think there are theoretical reasons why that must be false.
Sure. Now, I know we're already over time, but there are two more subjects I want to get to very quickly. One of them is something you brought up earlier with the 1970s as a turning point where things started getting worse, and with 9/11 as a turning point for seeing more progressive programs and for seeing progressivism gain an even greater foothold in the United States. Can you explain a little bit more about why the 1970s, the early 1970s, and why 9/11 are turning points?
Well, as far as the 70s, I'm a big borrower, it's a hard word to say, of Rothbard's theory of history as a race between state and society. So after a number of decades of the buildup of government programs, in particular, I think, the Great Society, the double whammy of the Great Society and the Vietnam War, each of which was quite expensive, you start to have the inflation of the money supply, which leads to the boom and bust process of recession, and that simultaneous recession and inflation, which only the Austrians could really explain, and kind of refuted a lot of the other economic theories. But I think the 70s was just the time when the government started to consume so many resources and interfere so much with the marketplace that the ability of the marketplace to keep up its productivity and continue material progress basically ended. And I read a statistic the other day, and often these people wanted to explain, well, Jesus, why did people vote for Trump? And obviously there's a racial, ethnic, religious component in politics, which is, by the way, covered in great detail in the book. But so that explains why I'm citing the statistic. But the statistic was basically, and I know there's some dispute about this, but I tend to think the statistic is basically true, that white men in the United States have not had a raise since like the 70s. So that's, we may have a few toys and bells and whistles that we didn't have then, but I think that statistic is basically true. As somebody who's 59 and have a pretty good perspective on what things were like in the 60s compared to what they are now. So you've had the stagnation from the 70s, and I think that I'm not necessarily saying, I mean, the actual attack of 9/11 caused, there's estimates on what it caused, $100 billion or whatever. In historical terms, not really a huge hit economically. Obviously, the tragedy of 3,000 dead is horrible, but we're talking about economics here. But the reaction to 9/11, which actually was a typical progressive reaction, which is that government's going to solve this problem. We're not going to analyze why the government caused the problem in the first place. And by the way, I have some very detailed essays online on LouRockwell.com about how the government contributed to 9/11, the problems before that day and after. But again, the progressive is always going to ignore the government's role in creating these problems and always going to seek a non-governmental scapegoat and therefore propose some sort of a government solution. So you saw George Bush, who's basically, a progressive in the small p progressive as we define it in the book, somebody who's very comfortable with government intervention, going out and starting these various wars. And the collective economic, we're still obviously dealing with the chaos of what's going on in the Middle East. We can't go through all that now since you're short of time. But the simple out-of-pocket costs of those wars, I think, did cause an actual economic decline in the living standards of Americans. And both because this was inevitable that as time went on, you would have this decline, but the triggering event of the response to 9/11, I think that's a pretty good demarcation line of where we have actual arguable decline in America for the first time since folks landed at Jamestown.
All right. And then one final question for you before we wrap up. What are the best ways to defeat progressivism and to restore what we might call classical liberalism, or at least move in the direction of classical liberalism and actual liberty?
Well, I guess one of the reasons why I wrote the book is that to explain why the liberty movement, which has done a lot of good work, there's a lot of good people in it, and has spent a lot of money, actually, but hasn't really made much tangible progress over the years, is that there's this, mental force field around people's minds that we cannot penetrate. So I think the first solution is to understand what you're dealing with here and why sort of a frontal assault of syllogisms and economic theory doesn't really work. There's no magic solution here, but I think the first point is you have to understand what you're dealing with here. And I think progressives themselves have to understand what progressivism is, and that it's not a rational system of thought, that it's this psychological contrivance that people have, which is not, and I argue very vociferously, it's not good for progressives themselves. And again, there's no magic formula for getting out of this trap that so many people are in. But unless we understand what the actual trap is, it's hopeless. And hopefully that's a good first step. As far as political action, I've written 3 books now, actually. I have a lifelong experience with electoral politics, which is delineated in some of my books. I've been a political consultant. I've run for office. Have vast electoral, more than I care to admit, experience in elections. And the bottom line is that the system is rigged so that libertarian efforts will not succeed. And so what I do in all 3 books, including Progressivism, there's chapter 10 is what to do about all this, by the way. It's not just a bunch of theory. My belief is that direct citizen action, which I define as excluding both politics and lobbying, is the way to go. And the most obvious example of that is to avoid the government schools through homeschooling or private schools, Catholic schools, or whatever, depending on your religious point of view. And that that one action of a massive withdrawal from the government schools would accomplish wonders in this fight. And there's other detailed proposals in the book, but that, I have to say, take this opportunity. I've been telling the movement this for 10 years, and the movement, the movement wants to do other things, and I'm getting increasingly frustrated about it. We just went through this, election. There was a libertarian candidate on the ballot, or allegedly libertarian anyway, and a lot of money was spent, a lot of energy, a lot of people went to rallies and held signs and whatever. What was accomplished, I don't know, but if that energy had been redirected into pulling just 100,000 students out of government schools, that would have a huge and immediate impact. So I do have loads of specific ideas, and that's why I put libertymovement.org up, which I admit right now is a fairly basic site, but I'm going to be reducing my law practice this year and shortly, and hopefully building up that website and getting around the country and talking more about these ideas.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for joining me today. You obviously mentioned libertymovement.org, but what are some of the other ways to follow your work and for listeners to learn more about what we've been discussing today? And then is there anything else you would like to say about libertymovement.org in particular?
Sure. I write at LouRockwell.com and have for a number of years. I'm affiliated with the Mises Institute, Mises.org. That's a great place to go for scholarly work and lots of other information. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, easy to find. And there's not too many, let me brag a little bit, there's not too many libertarians who have a column in a weekly newspaper. And there's 4 weekly papers up in Buffalo where my occasionally weekly column appears. One of them is Art Voice, which is in Buffalo. The other one's the Niagara Falls Reporter. And those are the 2 main ones. There's a couple smaller community papers, but those are both online. And if you Google it, you can get to those sites and read. I had an article about Uber. Buffalo's the last major city that doesn't have Uber. And I, of course, took the opportunity to bash progressivism, which is the reason why we don't have Uber, and talk about maybe what we can do about it. So, I have another column coming out about the Buffalo public schools, which, like most systems, is a complete failure. And there's another political figure up here who's tried to fix it, and I basically said, nah, it can't be fixed. So a little friendly debate among Buffalonians there. So I'm easy to find online, and you'll be hearing more from me throughout the course of the year.
Okay, well, great. And I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/progressivism, and there will be links to the book we've been discussing today, which of course is Progressivism, a primer on the idea destroying America, as well as the 2 other books mentioned in the introduction and all of the resources and websites that we've discussed over the course of this interview. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/progressivism is the place to go to find resources related to this episode. And I want to encourage everybody, while you're on our website, to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so you can get all the episodes and not miss any. And Jim, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and for joining me and for discussing progressivism and defining progressivism and taking a look at why it's such a problem and what might be able to stop the onslaught of progressivism. So thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to speaking with you again sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adam. It was a lot of fun, and anytime I'd be happy to be back on.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.